welcome everyone to this first iteration of Air Power Wins Wars live in front of a studio audience between Justin and I. And we're going to talk about the prelude to the Battle of the Coral Sea today, which was, of course, a battle fought out in May 1942. It's the first carrier battle in history, and it ended up with a loss of a single carrier on both sides. Several others were then damaged as well, and aircraft losses, other ship losses in the battle as well. And most significantly, it was also a reversal of the strategic situation for Japan, which had been primarily on the offensive at this point, and this kind of put a stop to that. Now, the question, of course, is why this happened, why this battle happened, and that's what we're going to explain. This is sponsored by the Naval Institute Press, who has sent both of us a review copy of this book, Gamble in the Coral Sea by Michal Piegzik. It is a really fascinating book because it looks primarily at the Japanese perspective in the run-up and during the operation of the battle, and it is a valuable source for this video, and we're going to talk more about that. Big thank you here also to all the supporters who make this channel possible. The Battle of the Coral Sea happens because of Operation Mo. And Operation Mo was intended to seize control of both Tulagi as well as Port Moresby, so that's in the Solomon Islands there, and then in Papua New Guinea. On the southern coast of New Guinea, they're specifically facing Australia. And this operation took place during that very sort of uncertain period during phase 2 of the Japanese war plan. Let's talk about the Japanese war plan in its totality, starting sort of with the initial outset and how we actually get to this situation in May 1942. Now, in the summer of 1941, Japan starts to finalize its war plan, the Southern Operation, as it is known, to take control of the southeastern part of Asia, and then also expand into this sort of very resource-rich area. And it was hoped that this would then establish them with a sense of self-sufficiency that allows Japan to rule not just this area, but also to fuel its potential further expansion goals, or just keeping the US and the Commonwealth at bay. Now, to do this, what Japan would do is, on the one hand, of course, strike Pearl Harbor. That's this sort of event that everybody talks about, with the aim there to delay or weaken the US Navy response and the US's response as a whole. Now, there is also an argument here that Yamamoto may have hoped that the shock of this attack, as well as the intended losses that would come out of this, specifically, for example, destroying carriers, which did not happen, in combination with a lot of other attacks in the Southeast Pacific, would then result in an early negotiated settlement with the US by breaking its willingness to fight. We're not going to go into that a little bit more, but I thought I'd just mention it as well. Now, simultaneously to the attack of Pearl Harbor, there would also be the Southern operations there to seize the resource-rich Southeast Asia, and to eliminate the British and the Commonwealth threat, and so also sort of the local countries that still maintained their independence at this point. And to eliminate that and take control. Now, part of this, of course, was British Malaya. It was also Hong Kong and the Philippines, and the campaigns there would be launched via air, sea, and land maneuver. The Philippines, if you look at that, of course, is a vital geographic position. It was deemed necessary to control this area to then expand further south into what was then known as the Dutch East Indies, mainly Indonesia nowadays. And as we then move on, the first stages of this operation went very well. Singapore fell in February 1942. The Philippines were then falling in May 1942, and in fact, the Dutch East Indies had already fallen in March 1942. And the hope was then, as Japan was driving further towards what is here Papua New Guinea with Port Moresby, that by establishing control in that area as well, they would eventually have this defensive perimeter where they first of all could extract raw resources from, and also attract any sort of American counterattack and destroy those naval forces that come in a decisive battle. The maximum extent, roughly, of the Japanese advance is colored in yellow here. And I just want to press one important thing home, and that is that this was not easy. And the fact that Japan managed to do this in in less than half a year, is astonishing, considering that if you, for example, look at this map here, you have Netherlands, East Indies, so Netherlands, Oost-Indië, which is a lot of it is Indonesia nowadays, and that is superimposed on Europe, and you can kind of get an idea of the geography here. That is not even just all the area, that is just the East Indies, and it is, of course, not just land, it is land, sea, which gives you sort of an idea of the complexity of maintaining this advance and maintaining the speed and the initiative, how difficult that was. Now, the area that we're going to talk about today is marked in blue here, with the arrow pointing to one of the final objectives, which was Port Moresby. And it was hoped, of course, that once Japan has control of Tulagi and Port Moresby, they are in total control here, and they have established this defensive perimeter. Now, this was a very simplified rundown, but it gets us to the point that we need to be at for this episode. And of course, as they always say, no plan survives contact with the adversary. And while largely the Allies were on the back foot towards the first couple of months of the operations, suddenly, sort of in February, March, April, the US Navy does show up with a couple of task forces, does conduct some carrier raids, and it is now for Japan, the phase 2 is at risk of failing because a US task force, Task Force 17, has arrived in the area to throw a wrench into the plans. And it's this point that I'm going to move it over to Justin and basically ask you, Justin, what sort of command was responsible for the last final thrust into this area? And I believe there's one name that regular viewers know very well who is going to show up now, isn't there?
Yeah, so this is going to be a familiar face to some of the regular viewers of the channel. So it's Vice Admiral Inoue Shigeyoshi. He was Commander-in-Chief at this time of 4th Fleet, which was headquartered at Truk. During the actual fighting of Operation MO, he would actually be sailing kind of generally toward the battle area on Kashima, his command ship, the flagship of 4th Fleet, which was actually a training cruiser. It was nothing particularly remarkable. So people will likely be familiar with him at this point for his radical air power advocacy and moderate political views prior to the war against the Western Allies. Inoue was highly regarded for his intellect, but the assessment of most of his peers, and certainly after the outcome of Operation MO, and later historians, is that he was ill-suited to operational command. In other words, he was a better administrator, strategic thinker, and educator than he was a fighting admiral. 4th Fleet itself, despite its position staring down the United States across the Pacific, frequently found itself under-resourced. I've mentioned this in the past, but the front toward the United States and Australia was not seen as a priority theater during the initial phase of the Southern operation. The real prizes were in Southeast Asia. 4th Fleet was only really expected to kind of mine shop in the Central Pacific and grab key territories such as Guam, Wake. This is one I've never pronounced before out loud, so I'm going to butcher it. Kavieng and Rabaul. Of these, only resistance on Wake caused notable problems. Everything else kind of just moved along.
And talking about sort of notable problems, the Japanese operations, they seem to have been, yes, very daring, yes, very successful initially, but they also seem to have quite a few assumptions and be predicated on things falling in place just the way it was planned. So, how did, as we look sort of into 1942 and into this area, how did that turn out?
I'm going to be breezing over a lot of stuff here. Basically, the transition between phase one, which is kind of roughly ending with the seizure of the southern resource area, primarily the Dutch East Indies, and then this nebulous continuation, expansion of the defense perimeter of phase two. This is where things started to come off the rails a little bit. There were lots of different competing interests and views about what do we do now, because they had been so spectacularly successful up to this point. They were basically ahead of schedule, and now they were starting to get to a point where there was no consensus on what to do next. There was a brief discussion of the possibility of an invasion of Northern Australia. This was pretty much shut down entirely by January 1942 for the very simple reason that the Army was like, it would take at least 10 divisions, and we are not giving you, the Navy, that much resources to actually invade Northern Australia. Aware that Australia could become a base for a possible future Allied counterattack against the Japanese defensive perimeter, the decision was made to cut Australia off from the United States instead. So sea air superiority was going to be required to accomplish this. The little box that's highlighted there on this kind of map of potential future Japanese advances, that's the general area that Operation FS, a later operation, was going to seize to kind of complete this encirclement of Australia, cutting it off from the United States. So you can see that since we're talking about seizure of Port Moresby and Tulagi, that there was still a long way to go to actually complete this goal entirely. Now, unfortunately for the Japanese, the Americans had a vote in the South Pacific too. So they sent Lexington to raid the new Japanese base at Rabaul. This resulted in the action off Bougainville on February 20th, 1942. Lexington was detected on its approach and was set upon by the land-based G4Ms of the newly arrived 4th Kokutai. Lexington was forced onto the defensive and had to call off the raid on Rabaul, but 4th Kokutai suffered terribly and failed to score any hits on the carrier. This engagement set off a very subtle chain of events, minor delays and changes in thinking that would lead to the Battle of the Coral Sea, even though neither side understood it at the time. And Chris and I actually did a whole video on this action in detail. 4th Fleet later seized Lae and Salamoa on the north coast of New Guinea on March 8, 1942. And the carriers Lexington and Yorktown hit these new positions, and perhaps more importantly, 4th Fleet's invasion force on March 10th, 1942, which Chris also did a video on, actually. Now, 4th Fleet had always been operating with really thin force margins. The bulk of Japanese power had either been directed against Pearl Harbor or into the Southern Resources area, and 4th Fleet was operating on a shoestring. And this carrier raid finally broke it. It did enough damage to what 4th Fleet had available that they had to stop and rethink, and the seizure of Port Moresby and Tulagi was delayed by a month.
Considering this, then, the shoestring that you were talking about, and the forces that were available at the time, and the importance of actually finishing this operation, that's where we turn then to the question of how come they actually didn't send the majority of their carriers in order to support this. So if you want to get sort of into that discussion of what was the Japanese thinking regarding their carriers in this operation, and which ones were actually available.
Yeah, so the damage caused by this raid called into question the ability of limited land-based air cover from Rabaul and seaplane cover from tenders to cover further advances. And for those of you who are maybe a little bit better read on this very early part of the war, it's extremely interesting seeing just how thin this air cover was. Like, it was frequently a handful of float planes from a seaplane tender. It was very fragile. So of course, once big fleet carriers came up and slapped it around, there was very precious little to resist. So this concern was spearheaded by Major General Hori Tomitaro. He was the commander of the South Seas Detachment. This was the main army force that was tasked with actually invading these various locations in the South Pacific. He initially suggested that the light carrier Shōhō, which was already attached to Fourth Fleet since early February 1942, that this would maybe be sufficient. Shōhō had spent its time up to this point ferrying aircraft from Truk to Rabaul and engaging in anti-submarine warfare patrols around Truk. Combined Fleet, for their part, later added Kaga to Fourth Fleet's roster to help bolster air cover for Operation MO, the invasion of Port Moresby. However, she'd actually run aground earlier, and she was currently in dry docks for repairs that were taking longer than anticipated. And worse still, Fourth Fleet staff felt that a single fleet carrier was insufficient for the scale of operation. Inoue initially requested the second carrier division instead, so Hiryu and Soryu, but this was denied by Combined Fleet, who wanted to hold on to them for Operation MI, which would be the attack against Midway. Combined Fleet instead offered up the less experienced 5th Carrier Division, Shokaku and Zuikaku. These were very new carriers that were quite capable, but because they were relatively new, this carrier division was considered the least experienced in the fleet. It didn't have the best reputation yet. It's in a way, it's kind of like saying they were the worst of the best, because this is already like these were fleet carriers. They were still some of the best in the Navy, but they weren't quite as high a reputation as the 1st and 2nd carrier divisions. Now, Inoue and 4th Fleet did not argue, because basically it was a much better deal than only receiving Kaga, which had been what was originally promised. So they went from 1 fleet carrier to 2. They didn't get the 2 more experienced ones, but they weren't really going to argue that point. Now, allocating only 2 carriers is criticized, I think rightly, and Piegzik lays the blame on everyone involved in both 4th Fleet and Combined Fleet. Inoue never asked for more than 2 carriers, and Combined Fleet never offered or suggested more either. So the blame kind of gets spread all around here, that it's seemingly nobody recognized that 2 carriers was probably not sufficient for the operation, or if they did, they didn't speak up. Either way, what ends up coming later is a large byproduct of this decision. And I want to make this clear, even steering clear of hindsight, the Japanese were well aware of the considerable Allied land-based air threat in the South Pacific at this time, and also that there was a significant Allied surface presence, which they had even overestimated as containing at least 1 British battleship. And they anticipated also that 1 American carrier would be present, not 2, because they thought they'd already sunk Lexington by submarine. Of course, they were mistaken on that, but even setting that aside, this is a significant force that was going to be opposing Operation MO. So then the question then starts to become this new debate over what would the carriers do exactly in this operation. And a major back and forth occurred over Inoue's initial insistence that the 5th Carrier Division would hit bomber bases in Cooktown and Townsville in Northern Australia, along with a separate raid on Port Moresby. This idea had stemmed from Inoue's discussion with the 25th Air Flotilla, Kokusentai. That was the main land-based aviation unit. They were based out of Rabaul, which had suffered some sizable attrition prior to Operation MO. And as a result of this, there was a lot of consternation about the Allied land-based air power. So Inoue kind of took this on board, and he kept pushing for these raids that the carriers would need to conduct. Now, opponents of these raids pointed out that the carriers would be severely overburdened with duties if the plan went ahead. Never mind the danger posed by, again, at least 1 American carrier that happened to be lurking around, and protection duties over the 2 different invasion convoys. Now they would be pulled way south to go attack Allied bomber bases, and also, of course, be exposed to attack themselves from these same bases. So there was some pretty significant pushback here. And eventually, Rear Admiral Hara Chuichi, who was the commander of the 5th Carrier Division, and other critics won out. The raid on Townsville was canceled, and raids on Cooktown and Port Moresby would be left to Hara's tactical discretion. This was changed again when Combined Fleet itself, so this was their over Fourth Fleet's heads, stepped in and fully canceled any 5th Carrier Division raids against Australian bases so it could focus on the enemy carrier task force, which I think is the right move, and Piegzik certainly agrees. So instead of these planned raids, however, 5th Carrier Division would need to deliver 9 Zeros to the land-based Tainan Kokutai to replenish recent losses that they had suffered. So this is something that really needs to be underlined here, because it sometimes can even be forgotten by the naval historians, which I will kind of describe as they kind of sail into the story of the South Pacific on the decks of the carriers and sail out on the decks of the carriers. And the thing is that this is actually like the carriers were kicking in the door and like coming in, flailing their arms around in the midst of an air war that had already been going on for months and would continue on for months and years after they left. So Tainan Kokutai really needed these Zeros, and sometimes, certainly in some of the older histories, they can be really dismissive of this duty that was placed on it. The thing is that Tainan Kokutai was going to form an important part of the air cover for the invasion convoy. And Claringbold and Ingman, who looks much more at the land-based component of this, what was going on there, notes that the reinforcement of a full Chutai was really significant. However, this seemingly innocuous task would end up causing all sorts of headaches for Hara during the operation itself. Now, one final detail that is covered by Piegzik that I hadn't seen actually before and I found really interesting is the debate over what to do with Shōhō. So up to this point, we've really mainly been talking about the 2 big fleet carriers that were sent, but there was this little light carrier that was also provided. Now, the South Seas Detachment, who again had already been caught out in the Lei and Salamoa carrier raid on March 10th, they had that fresh in their mind and they wanted direct air cover. So in negotiations, Inoue decided to assign the light carrier Shōhō to this task. This came much to the horror of both Shōhō's skipper and its flight officer, who were well aware that their meager air group was totally inadequate to provide air cover for a whole convoy. It likely couldn't even provide sufficient air cover for itself. So this was a very dangerous proposition. They instead proposed to employ Shōhō alongside the 5th Carrier Division in order to just concentrate all the carrier air power they had. So just operate the 2.5 carriers basically together as one unit. However, Inoue stood his ground and disagreed. He sided with the South Seas Detachment, and Shōhō would remain on its own, just kind of moving along with the main body and invasion force. So that's kind of the initial setup for why we get into the position that we do on the eve of Operation MO. So that ends the little presentation.
Yeah, and just to give people a reminder of the air group that Shōhō has, we have 10 Zeros on there and still 6, which I still think are the worst named Allied covert of all of them, clones. That those are the older generation fighters with the 2 machine guns in them, and that's basically it. I mean, if we look at Kaga, then why was she even in the discussion if she was in dry dock? That is something that I can't quite understand.
I think the initial, so they'd actually used Kaga after she'd run aground and had some provisional repairs done, but she was limited to 18 knots, which is very slow. And I think they initially thought they were going to kind of just rush the repairs to get her ready for MO. And then just get her down there. And then the reports came back from dry dock that no, it was going to be like something like 3 to 4 weeks. And this was already well into April. So it was like clear that she wasn't going to be ready anyway. But it was kind of overtaken by events because, again, Kaga's just one carrier, even if it had a good reputation. And Fourth Fleet wanted at least a whole carrier division, so 2 carriers, which then became a whole, because now it started like they want to siphon off more resources from Operation MI, which again, Operation MI, the planned attack against Midway, that was the darling of Combined Fleet. That was at the forefront of Yamamoto's mind. That was the big show. So they were not going to easily give away extra resources to this other ancillary operation that, again, originally prior to March 10th, like they'd assumed that eventually Port Moresby would be captured with just whatever Fourth Fleet had. They weren't planning to send any significant assistance, but that was overtaken by events. And again, with negotiations, Inoue managed to talk it up from one fleet carrier to two, which is certainly an improvement. Um, they didn't get the two more experienced ones; they got the two less experienced ones, but still, it was something. And you kind of end up with this result. The Japanese were operating on pretty thin margins at this point, and they were trying to do, frankly, at this time, too much with too little. They had a very potent force available, particularly centered in the six big fleet carriers, but the way they ended up starting to employ them at this point, where they're like, oh, well, you can have these two, we'll hold these ones back for Operation MI. And there was also an assumption that hope, or an expectation, I should say, that hopefully Shokaku and Zuikaku would come out of Operation MO in good shape so that they could then just be shuttled back up and participate in Operation MI, which of course ends up not happening after the actual outcome of the Battle of the Coral Sea.
Quickly go to this part. So this is actually the battle, sort of the way the fleets tracked from each other. How, if we sort of look here at May 8th, Lexington and Yorktown are damaged, and Shokaku is then also damaged at the same day. The day before that, Shōhō was sunk. What was sort of the reaction of the Japanese side to having their light carrier sunk this early on in the operation?
Yeah, so they were obviously, there was a lot of some kind of shock and consternation. It obviously didn't come as a surprise to people like Shōhō's skipper, who kind of foresaw this kind of problem happening. Again, we're not going to go blow by blow. This is a very complex and confusing battle, which is something that really comes through strongly in a lot of good histories of this battle, including Piegzik. I think something that he does very well that people will be very new to is people are very used to how confusing this battle was from the American perspective. And then you read this and you get it from the Japanese perspective, and it's basically two sides that had no idea what was going on half the time. And there's a lot of mistakes in scouting on both sides. The Americans basically overkill Shōhō to a ridiculous degree. The number of hits is wild. The ship was annihilated. And then, of course, the Japanese did the same thing to the oiler Neosho and the destroyer Sims, which had been mistaken as a carrier and a cruiser.
That's where that limited experience from Shokaku and Shokaku comes in.
Yeah, and he actually has some really good detail on specifically the B5Ns that reported what they saw for Neosho. And in fact, he gets all the way down to the individual personnel level where there was a decision made that the more experienced crew would be held back for the actual attack to give it the highest chance of success. So they sent out a less experienced crew for scouting, and then this kind of ended up biting them, where they made mistakes. They thought that there was they initially, it's like they thought initially that it was a carrier. Then there was another sighting report. It's like, oh, there's like an oiler around here too. And then there was another sighting, but then they were constantly assuming that their first mistaken sighting that there was a carrier just meant that there was an oiler around, but there was also a carrier around. And the fact of the matter was they were always mistaken from the beginning. They hadn't seen a carrier. At the same time, they actually got other reports from some of the float planes that actually had spotted the American Task Force 17. And again, like he has actually a really good figure in the book as well, where he actually shows you all of the different Japanese sighting reports and what they were telling them. And then it's like you look at that figure now from the perspective of hindsight, and you're like, what's going on? I can't even imagine what it felt like actually standing on the bridge trying to figure out what was happening.
I mean, that's a really good point. And I think also sort of the friction and the confusion, the fog of war that happens during these operations is something that when we look at it in hindsight, we're like, oh, how could they have made this decision, this and that decision? That tends to explain a lot already. And, as sort of historians, we always have to be mindful that from looking at it from a later standpoint, when we combine different perspectives and different countries' sources, that it's that we're in a very privileged position sometimes where passing judgment then can be quite easy, even if we don't always have all the information either. Which is why a book like this is really important, because it especially into the English-speaking historiography, it brings in a lot of stuff that was going on the Japanese side. Let us then, since there are already a couple of questions in the chat, talk about the book. Now, this does come from Naval Institute Press, of course. Channel sponsors. They've been partnered with the channel for many years now. We have a good relationship with them, and I always hear good stuff from all of you about the book purchases that you make from them. And of course, remember, you do have an all-year-round discount code that is MILABHIS, that gives you 25% off on book purchases. But of course, right now, they also have their holiday special. And if you buy it right now, it should still be up on the website. There's also the code HOLIDAY, 50% discount code there. If you're watching this on video on demand, that code may have passed by now. But remember, the all-year code MILABHIS works 365 days. Now, Justin, you are the resident PTO expert here. Can you give us a quick review of the book and what you think it brings to the table, and who do you think will benefit from this book and really enjoy reading it?
Yeah, so I am very impressed with it. Now, I actually knew of Piegzik before this book because he's also published stuff before on the Indian Ocean raid that I unfortunately hadn't gotten a chance to read yet. Now I really want to read it because this book is outstanding. So not only is this just is using Japanese sourcing, it is mining Japanese sourcing to the very depths of basically what is possible. It's not just like this is what the Senshi Sosho says. He's going all the way down to the individual records for all of the different land-based kokutai that were involved, all of the individual, many of the individual ships, recollections from various crew. He's also, I think. This is really nice as well, is he's engaging with the Japanese historiography. So in addition to bringing his own primary source-based analysis and his version of the battle from the Japanese perspective, he's also bringing the English language historiography up to date by relaying what certain Japanese historians are arguing about it, that have been published in like the 90s or the 2000s, that have not made its way into English understanding prior to this. So it's going to be basically probably an essential and very important book on this battle for likely decades to come, because again, it's not too often that someone comes along with this degree of Japanese language knowledge and expertise on just writing naval history like this. It'll pair very well with the existing historiography that's out there. I really do highly recommend it. It's very good.
Yeah, that is actually a point that I cannot emphasize enough. He, as far as I understand it, Piegzik learned Japanese as part of sort of his passion in researching this area, and that nowadays is so very valuable and really what is required to push the historiography forward. So thank you very much for Justin there for explaining all of this. Now I'm going to switch back to us, only us, without the presentation. And if you have at this point any questions in the chat about what we talked about, please do let me know. I've marked some down already here from Adrian, Scott, and Lucio, as well as Kislov, who already asked you preemptively on Blue Sky, actually. So since he got the first the foot in the door first.